Amira Khan was only 23 when she joined the army. She came from a small village surrounded by dry hills and dusty roads where life was simple but hard. Her father had been a schoolteacher, and her mother used to make handmade scarves to sell in the local market. They didn't have much, but they were happy until the war came. When the conflict reached their region, everything changed. One evening, while Amira was helping her mother prepare dinner, the sound of explosions echoed across the valley. The next morning, their school was gone, burned to ashes. Her father tried to help the villagers evacuate, but he never came back. That was the day Amira promised herself she would never stand by and watch her people suffer again. She didn't grow up dreaming of being a soldier. In fact, she wanted to be a nurse. She was gentle, calm, and always the one to comfort crying children or tend to sick neighbors. But the war made her realize something. People needed protection as much as they needed healing. When she turned 21, she made a bold decision. She would join the army as a medic. Her mother cried when she told her, but deep down, she was proud. Training was not easy. Most of the other recruits were men, some older, some stronger, and many doubted her from the start. They laughed quietly when she arrived, a slim young woman carrying a heavy pack that looked almost bigger than her. The instructors didn't go easy on her either. Every day started before sunrise, running through mud, climbing ropes, crawling under barbed wire, and learning how to shoot and treat wounds in the middle of chaos. Amira fell many times. Her hands were covered in blisters, her knees bruised and bleeding. But every time she fell, she got back up. What others didn't see was the fire that burned inside her. The memory of her father's smile, her mother's tears, and the fear she once felt as a helpless girl hiding from bombs. She refused to be helpless ever again. After a few weeks, even the toughest soldiers began to notice her determination. She didn't talk much, but she worked harder than anyone. When someone was injured during drills, Amira was the first to reach them, patching up cuts and wrapping bandages with calm precision. Slowly, the men who once laughed started respecting her. One of them, Sergeant Bilal, once said, "If I ever get shot, I want Amira by my side." That made her smile quietly. Months passed, and Amira finished her training with honors. She was now officially a field medic in the National Army. She carried a medical kit on her back and a standard-issue rifle across her shoulder. She didn't like the weapon. She preferred to save lives, not take them, but she knew it was part of survival. Her first posting was at a border camp in a mountainous area. It was cold, windy, and far from home. She often wrote letters to her mother, telling her she was safe, even when she wasn't. The nights were filled with the distant sound of gunfire. The soldiers at the camp were tired, always alert, and sometimes scared. Amira became their quiet source of comfort. She checked on everyone daily, making sure they ate, took their medicine, and didn't lose hope. One night, while sitting around a small fire, one of the younger soldiers asked her, "Why did you really join, Amira? You could have been safe at home." She looked at the flames for a moment before answering. "Because if everyone waits for someone else to be brave, no one will ever be saved," she said softly. Her words silenced the group. They all stared at her with new respect. In time, Amira became known not just as a medic, but as someone who kept the team together. She had a natural sense of leadership, not through shouting orders but by setting an example. She never complained, never gave up, and never hesitated to run toward danger when someone was hurt. But even with all her courage, she sometimes lay awake at night, staring at the stars, wondering if she was strong enough. She missed her home, her mother, and the days when life was simple. Yet every morning, when the sun rose over the hills, she reminded herself why she was there. Because there were people who needed her, soldiers who depended on her, and a promise she had made to her father's memory. Then one day, an urgent message arrived at the camp. A nearby outpost had come under sudden attack. Reinforcements were needed immediately. Amira's unit was ordered to move at dawn. The mood shifted. Everyone grew tense, packing ammunition and supplies. For most soldiers, this would be another mission, but for Amira, it was her first real battle. She didn't show fear, though her heart raced. She carefully checked her medical kit, ensuring she had enough bandages, painkillers, and disinfectant. She cleaned her rifle, though she prayed she wouldn't need to use it. The next morning, as the sun rose red over the horizon, the trucks rolled out toward the valley. Dust filled the air. Amira sat in the back of one, gripping her helmet tightly. The soldiers beside her tried to joke, pretending not to be scared. But everyone could feel the tension. Halfway there, the convoy was hit by enemy fire. Explosions thundered across the valley. The trucks screeched to a stop, and soldiers jumped out, taking cover behind rocks. Amira's hands trembled for a second. Then she took a deep breath and remembered her training. She ran to the nearest injured soldier, her medical bag swinging at her side. That was the first day she realized how quickly life and death could trade places. She treated burns, stopped bleeding, and whispered words of comfort to men twice her age who cried out in pain. By the time backup arrived, Amira had saved 5 lives. When the commander reviewed the mission later, he mentioned her name in front of everyone. She kept calm when chaos broke loose, he said. That's real courage. From that day on, no one doubted her again. She was no longer the quiet new recruit. She was Amira Khan, the medic who stayed calm under fire. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The hardest test of her life was still ahead. A moment when she would stand in the middle of a real battle, holding a broken rifle, and do something that would shock everyone who saw it. After the battle near the valley, Amira's courage became known across the camp. People began to greet her with respect, and even the officers started trusting her with more responsibility. She didn't seek attention. She still spent her evenings cleaning her equipment, writing letters to her mother, and praying quietly. But deep down, she felt stronger than ever before. Days turned into weeks, and life at the camp went on with a strange mix of calm and tension. Some days were peaceful, with soldiers sharing jokes and drinking tea under the open sky. Other days were filled with the echo of gunfire from distant hills. No one ever really relaxed, not when danger could appear at any moment. One afternoon, Amira was helping restock the medical tent when a messenger ran in, breathing hard. "Orders from command," he shouted, holding a crumpled paper. The officer in charge read it quickly, his face turning serious. "Everyone listen up," he said. "We've been called to support the frontline base in Kunar Valley. They've been under heavy attack since last night. We move out before sunrise." The camp fell silent for a moment. Everyone knew about Kunar Valley, a rough, mountainous region surrounded by cliffs and dense trees. The enemy had strong positions there, and fighting was always fierce. Amira felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors that many soldiers never returned from that valley. That night, Amira sat by the fire, checking her supplies again and again. Bandages, morphine, antiseptic, tourniquets. Every item could mean the difference between life and death. Across the fire, Sergeant Bilal noticed her quiet face and said gently, "You don't have to go to the front, Amira. You're a medic. You can stay back at the field post." Amira looked up. "If the wounded are there, then that's where I need to be," she said firmly. There was no fear in her voice, only resolve. Bilal nodded, realizing there was no point in arguing. Before dawn, the soldiers lined up beside their trucks. The air was cold and heavy with fog. Amira tightened her helmet strap and climbed into the back of the first vehicle. She could feel the weight of what lay ahead, but she didn't show it. As they drove through the narrow dirt roads leading into the valley, the sound of distant explosions grew louder. Smoke rose in the distance, dark against the pale morning sky. Birds flew away from the noise, and the wind carried the faint smell of burning metal. The convoy reached a checkpoint halfway through, where soldiers from the forward base greeted them with tired eyes. "It's bad up ahead," one of them warned. "We lost contact with the southern unit. Be ready for anything." When they finally reached the outpost, chaos had already taken over. The small base was surrounded by rocky hills, and enemy gunfire echoed from above. Several tents were burning, and medics were rushing between wounded soldiers laid out on the ground. Amira jumped off the truck without waiting for orders. She dropped to her knees beside a soldier whose leg was bleeding badly. "Stay with me," she said softly. cutting open the pant leg and tying a tight bandage. The man winced in pain but nodded. All around her, the noise was deafening. Rifles cracking, radios shouting, grenades exploding in the distance. Dust filled the air, and the smell of smoke stung her eyes. She moved from one soldier to another, patching wounds, giving injections, calling for stretchers. There was no time to think, only to act. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook the ground. A truck nearby burst into flames, throwing shrapnel in every direction. Amira ducked behind a sandbag wall, covering her head. When the dust cleared, she saw one of the communication officers lying on the ground, unconscious. She crawled to him and checked his pulse, weak, but still there. "Help me move him," she shouted, and 2 soldiers came running. Together they carried him to the tent, where Amira began working quickly. She cleaned his wound and started in 4-line with trembling but steady hands. Hours passed like minutes. The sun climbed high, but no one noticed. The heat mixed with smoke made it hard to breathe. Amira's uniform was soaked with sweat and dirt, her hands shaking from exhaustion, but she didn't stop. Every time she wanted to rest, she saw another soldier calling for help. In the middle of it all, she heard an officer shouting, "We need to send a team to the ridge. They're cutting off our supply line." The commanding officer pointed toward a group of soldiers, including Sergeant Bilal. You, and you, move to the ridge immediately." Then he turned to Amira. "We might need medical support up there. You're coming too." Amira hesitated only for a second, then grabbed her kit and followed. The path up the ridge was steep and exposed. Bullets hit the rocks near their feet, sending chips flying. They ran, ducking low, breathing hard. When they reached the top, they found a small defensive post, damaged and half-abandoned. That's when Amira realized something strange. The spare rifles they had brought were old and rusty. Some didn't even work properly. Supplies were clearly mixed up during transport. One of the soldiers tested his rifle. It jammed instantly. "It's useless," he cursed, throwing it down. Amira's heart sank. They were under attack, short on ammunition, and their weapons were failing. Still, she knew panic would only make things worse. "Focus on defense," she yelled. "We can't lose this position." Even though she was a medic, she started helping them reinforce the barricade, dragging sandbags and handing out ammunition. Then she moved to check the wounded. One man had been hit in the shoulder, another in the leg. She worked fast, ignoring the noise around her. Suddenly, another explosion hit close by, knocking her to the ground. Her ears rang, and dust filled her eyes. When she looked down, she saw her own rifle lying beside her. The barrel bent, useless. It must have been damaged when the blast hit. She picked it up and tried to pull the trigger, but nothing happened. It was completely broken. For a moment, fear washed over her. She was surrounded by chaos, her weapon was gone, and the enemy was closing in. She could have hidden, waited for help, or run for cover. But that wasn't who Amira was. She took a deep breath, looked around at her injured comrades, and made a choice that would soon change everything. She wasn't going to retreat. She would stay and fight, with or without a working rifle. The soldiers around her didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something they would never forget. Dust filled the air as gunfire echoed across the ridge. Amira coughed, trying to clear her lungs, but the smoke was thick and heavy. Her hands shook as she reached for her rifle, the same one she had carried since her first day of training. She wiped the dirt from it and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. Her heart sank. The rifle was broken. The barrel had bent from the blast, and the firing pin was jammed. In that moment, she felt a wave of fear rush through her. Around her, soldiers were shouting orders, bullets were flying, and explosions shook the ground. She was in the middle of a war zone without a working weapon. For a second, she froze. Her mind screamed, "What can I do now?" She was a medic, not a frontline fighter, but she knew that on this ridge, everyone had to fight to survive. She looked around. Sergeant Bilal was firing from behind a rock. Another soldier was reloading, and 2 men lay bleeding beside a sandbag wall. Amira's instincts took over. She threw the useless rifle aside and crawled toward the wounded soldiers. One had a deep cut across his chest, the other had been hit in the leg. Both were losing blood fast. She tore open her medical kit and started working, ignoring the gunfire. Her fingers moved quickly, cleaning, bandaging, injecting painkillers. "Hold on," she whispered to one of them. "You're going to make it." A bullet whizzed past her ear, hitting the sand just inches away. She didn't flinch. Her focus was on saving lives. Then she heard Sergeant Bilal shout, "We're running out of ammo. They're closing in." Amira looked up. Through the smoke, she could see enemy fighters moving closer, climbing the ridge, firing as they advanced. Her heart pounded in her chest. If they reached the top, everyone there would be killed or captured. She needed to do something, anything. She scanned the ground, searching for a weapon. That's when she noticed a broken machine gun lying near a fallen soldier. The tripod was shattered, and the belt jammed, but it was better than nothing. Crawling low, she made her way to it, dragging her medical bag behind her. When she reached the gun, she inspected it quickly. The barrel was overheated, but the mechanism wasn't completely destroyed. She remembered the maintenance lessons from training, how to clear a jam and restart a weapon. With trembling hands, she opened the cover, pulled out the damaged rounds, and fed a new belt of bullets. Her fingers were slick with blood. She couldn't tell if it was hers or someone else's. Sweat dripped into her eyes, but she didn't stop. The enemy was less than 50 meters away now. She slammed the cover shut, aimed toward the ridgeline, and pressed the trigger. The gun roared to life. The noise was deafening, echoing through the valley. Amira's entire body shook from the recoil, but she kept firing, sweeping across the hillside. Enemy fighters dove for cover, shouting and scrambling backward. The soldiers around her looked in disbelief. "That's Amira!" someone shouted. "She's manning the gun." Bilal turned and saw her, the young medic who had never fired a machine gun before, holding the ridge by herself. "Keep going," he yelled. "Don't stop." Amira didn't stop. She fired until the belt ran out, then quickly reached for another. Her shoulder burned, her ears rang, but adrenaline kept her moving. Between bursts, she ducked down to check on the wounded, making sure they were still breathing. Suddenly, the gun jammed again. She hit the side trying to fix it, but it wouldn't budge. Enemy fire picked up once more. She looked around for cover but saw none. She had only seconds to act. Then she saw a grenade lying beside a fallen soldier. Without thinking, she grabbed it, pulled the pin, and threw it toward the enemy position. The explosion sent dust and rocks flying, forcing them to retreat a few steps. It gave her just enough time to fix the jam and resume firing. The battle raged for what felt like hours. The sun was high now, burning hot, and smoke covered everything. Amira's throat was dry, and her arms felt heavy, but she refused to stop. Every time she looked at the wounded men beside her, she remembered why she was there. She wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to protect them. When the reinforcements finally arrived, the sound of their trucks and heavy guns filled the air. The enemy began to pull back, disappearing into the hills. The ridge was safe again. As the shooting died down, silence fell over the battlefield. Amira sat back, breathing hard. Her uniform was torn, her hands trembling, her face covered in dust. Around her, the soldiers slowly stood up, checking each other. Some were bleeding, some crying, some laughing in relief. Sergeant Bilal walked over, his helmet crooked, and looked at her in disbelief. "You just saved the entire ridge," he said, still panting. "With a broken rifle." Amira gave a small smile, though her eyes were filled with exhaustion. "It wasn't the rifle," she said softly. "It was the will to fight." Later that evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, the surviving soldiers gathered near the edge of the ridge. The orange light fell on their tired faces. No one spoke for a while. Then one of them pointed at Amira's broken rifle lying in the dirt. "Keep it," Bilal said to her, "as a reminder of what courage really looks like." Amira looked at the bent weapon and nodded quietly. In her heart, She knew that this day would stay with her forever. The day when fear tried to stop her, but she refused to let it win. That night, as she sat near the fire, wrapping her bandaged hands, she thought about everything that had happened. She wasn't sure how she had done it, how she had found the strength to stand and fight when everything around her was falling apart. Maybe it was the memory of her father, or maybe it was the promise she made to protect others. Whatever it was, it had guided her through the chaos. She looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over her village long ago. The war wasn't over. She knew that. There would be more battles, more danger, more loss. But for now, she allowed herself a small moment of peace. In the distance, she could hear the quiet voices of the soldiers she had saved, laughing softly, alive because she hadn't given up. And in that moment, she realized something important. Courage wasn't about having the best weapon. It was about refusing to back down, even when your rifle was broken. Amira lay down beside the fire, her broken rifle beside her, and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I'll fight again, no matter what." And with that, she closed her eyes, ready for whatever came next. The morning after the fierce battle on the ridge was strangely quiet. Smoke still hung in the air, and the ground was covered with the marks of war. Empty bullet shells, torn uniforms, and the broken remains of weapons. The soldiers moved slowly, checking the wounded and collecting what was left of their supplies. Amira woke up with sore arms and a pounding headache. Her hands were wrapped in bandages, and her uniform was still stained with blood and dust. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was her broken rifle lying beside her. For a few seconds, she just stared at it. It reminded her of what had happened. The fear, the fire, and the strength she didn't know she had. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then set it down gently. "Get some rest, Amira," Sergeant Bilal said as he passed by. "You've done enough for one day." But Amira shook her head. "There's no rest in war," she replied softly. The soldiers at the ridge were waiting for new orders. Their radio had been damaged during the fight, and they had lost communication with the main base. Food and ammunition were running low, and several soldiers were badly injured. Amira moved from one to another, checking their wounds and giving water to those who could barely sit up. By midday, the sound of distant gunfire returned. The enemy was regrouping. Everyone knew they wouldn't stop so easily. The ridge they had fought to defend was still a key position. Whoever controlled it could control the valley below. Amira's commanding officer gathered the team. "We can't hold this place without support," he said. "We need to contact headquarters and call for reinforcements. But our radio is dead." "What about the field radio in the lower camp?" one soldier asked. The officer nodded grimly. "It's still working, but it's half a kilometer downhill, across open ground. Anyone who tries to reach it will be an easy target." For a moment, silence filled the group. Everyone looked at each other, knowing what that meant. Whoever went would be risking their life. Amira looked down at the wounded soldiers lying beside her. Some were barely conscious. They needed help, medicine, and evacuation. If the message didn't reach headquarters, none of them would survive the next attack. "I'll go," she said suddenly. Everyone turned toward her in shock. "Amira, that's suicide," Bilal protested. "You're a medic, not a runner. We'll send one of the scouts." But Amira stood firm. "The scouts are busy defending the line. I can move faster alone. I know the terrain, and I can take care of myself." The officer hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right," he said, "but be careful. If you can get that message through, you'll save us all." Amira quickly packed her small bag, a few bandages, a canteen, and a flare signal in case she made it. She didn't take a weapon. Her rifle was still broken, and there were no spares left. All she had was her courage. As she prepared to leave, Bilal caught her arm. "If you don't come back, I'll never forgive myself," he said. Amira smiled faintly. "Then I guess I have to come back." She set off down the slope, keeping low behind rocks and bushes. The air was hot and dry, and her boots crunched softly on the gravel. Every few steps, she stopped to listen. The sound of enemy movement echoed faintly from below, They were close. Halfway down, she saw smoke rising from the old supply camp. It was mostly destroyed, but if she could reach the radio tent, she might still be able to send a message. She crawled the rest of the way, keeping her body low to the ground. Then she heard footsteps, voices. Enemy soldiers were nearby, checking the area for survivors. Amira's heart pounded in her chest. She pressed herself flat against the dirt, holding her breath. 2 men walked past, speaking in a language she barely understood. One of them stopped, just a few meters away, and looked around. Amira stayed perfectly still, her heart beating so loudly she thought they could hear it. After a few seconds, they moved on. When the voices faded, she exhaled slowly and continued crawling toward the camp. Her knees ached, and her hands were scraped, but she didn't stop. Finally, she reached the ruined tent. The radio equipment was half buried under debris, but she spotted the antenna sticking out. She pushed aside the rubble and brushed off the dust. The power unit was damaged, but the battery looked intact. She flipped the switch, nothing. She hit it twice hard, still nothing. Desperation filled her chest. Then she remembered something. One of the technicians had told her once that the old models had a backup power line hidden inside. She opened the side panel, found the wire, and twisted it tightly. The radio crackled to life. "Base command, this is Ridge Unit 3, she shouted. "We need immediate support. Coordinates: Sector 92, North Ridge. We have wounded. Repeat, we have wounded and low ammunition." Static filled the speaker. For a few seconds, she thought the signal hadn't gone through. Then finally a voice answered. "Copy that, Ridge Unit 3. Reinforcements on the way. Hold position for 1 hour." Amira's shoulders dropped in relief. She had done it. But just as she was about to leave, she heard shouting behind her. The enemy had spotted her. Bullets ripped through the air, striking the dirt near her feet. She ran, clutching the small radio in her arms. The hill was steep, and rocks slid under her boots, but she kept going. A bullet grazed her shoulder, but she didn't stop. Her breath burned in her chest as she climbed. She could see the ridge now, her unit waiting at the top. "Amira! Over here!" Bilal shouted, waving. She was only a few meters away when another explosion went off behind her, knocking her to the ground. Pain shot through her leg. She looked down and saw blood, but she forced herself to crawl forward. Bilal ran down to meet her, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her the rest of the way. As soon as they reached cover, Amira handed him the radio. "Reinforcements, coming," she gasped before collapsing. The soldiers quickly carried her to the medical tent. She was pale and weak, but alive. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Bilal sitting beside her, smiling through his exhaustion. "You did it," he said softly. "You saved us." Amira smiled faintly. "I just did my duty." Within an hour, helicopters arrived, bringing supplies, medics, and reinforcements. The ridge was secure once again. The men who had once doubted her now looked at her with pure respect. That night, as she rested under a blanket, Amira thought about what had happened. She hadn't needed a gun to fight that day. Her bravery had been her weapon. She realized that sometimes the strongest soldiers are not the ones who fire the most bullets, but the ones who never give up, even when everything around them falls apart. Outside, the wind blew softly through the hills. Amira closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that tomorrow, she would stand again. Not because she was fearless, but because she was strong enough to keep moving despite the fear. The sun rose slowly over the valley the next morning, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. The ridge, once full of smoke and chaos, was now calm, at least for a moment. Amira sat quietly outside the tent, her leg wrapped in bandages, watching the light spread across the battlefield. Her body was weak, but her mind was restless. She had survived the impossible, running through gunfire, saving lives, and calling for help. The reinforcements had arrived just in time, bringing new soldiers, medics, and supplies. The wounded were being treated, and the defensive line was rebuilt. But everyone knew the fight wasn't over yet. The enemy had retreated to regroup. They would attack again, and soon. Sergeant Bilal approached her with a cup of tea. "You should rest," he said. Amira took the cup and smiled faintly. "Rest will come when it's quiet," she replied. He sighed. "You did more than any of us yesterday. You don't have to prove anything." Amira looked at him seriously. "It's not about proving. It's about surviving. We all have something to fight for. You, me, everyone here." Bilal nodded, saying nothing. Deep down, he knew she was right. Later that day, their commanding officer gathered the team. The map spread out on a wooden crate showed the valley below, dotted with red marks where enemy forces were spotted. "They're planning a full assault from the south side," he explained. "If they break through that line, we'll lose the ridge and the valley." He looked around at the tired faces. "We hold this position at all costs." Amira watched as the soldiers prepared, cleaning weapons, checking ammunition, reinforcing barricades. She couldn't move much because of her injured leg, but she insisted on helping. She reorganized medical supplies, prepared stretchers, and gave words of encouragement to those who looked afraid. When the attack finally came, it was sudden and brutal. The sound of explosions echoed through the valley, and dust filled the air. The enemy fired mortars from the hills, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Amira could feel the vibrations through her boots. "Positions! Everyone to your stations!" the officer shouted. Amira grabbed her medical bag and limped toward the front line. Bullets whistled past, hitting rocks and sandbags. A soldier nearby fell, clutching his shoulder. Without thinking, she ran to him, pulled him behind cover, and started patching him up. "Stay with me," she said calmly, pressing a bandage against his wound. Her hands were steady, even though her heart was racing. Then she heard someone yell, "They're flanking us from the left." Amira turned. The left side of the ridge was almost undefended. Most of the men were focused on the front. The enemy had found a weak spot. If they broke through there, the entire position would collapse. She looked around. There were no free soldiers nearby. Everyone was busy fighting or injured. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, despite her leg pain, she grabbed the fallen soldier's rifle and crawled toward the left side. When she reached the edge, she saw enemy fighters climbing the rocks, trying to reach the ridge. There were at least a dozen of them. Amira's heart pounded. She wasn't a trained sniper, but she remembered her shooting lessons. She aimed carefully and fired. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but the shot hit its mark. She fired again, then again. Her shots slowed the attackers, giving the others time to notice what was happening. Bilal saw her from across the ridge and shouted, "Cover the left!" Amira's holding them off. Within seconds, 2 more soldiers joined her, firing beside her. The air filled with dust and gunfire. Amira kept shooting until her magazine was empty, then threw the rifle aside and crawled to another fallen soldier to check if he was alive. "Stay down, don't move," she told him, wrapping a cloth around his bleeding arm. She worked fast, her hands moving as if they had a life of their own. The battle raged for hours. The heat was unbearable, and smoke stung everyone's eyes. Ammunition ran low, and the soldiers' voices grew hoarse from shouting. Still, they refused to back down. Amira moved like a shadow among them, treating the wounded, passing ammunition, shouting directions. She was no longer just a medic. She was part of the fight. Then came the turning point. An explosion hit the middle of their defense line, throwing several soldiers to the ground. The machine gun post was destroyed, and the enemy began advancing again. Without thinking, Amira ran toward the fallen machine gun. The metal was twisted and hot, but she remembered fixing one before. She pulled at the jammed belt, using a piece of cloth to protect her hands. Bilal ran to her side. "You can't use that. It's done." Amira didn't listen. She worked quickly, clearing the chamber, and replaced the broken belt with a new one she found nearby. "Cover me," she said. Within seconds, the gun came to life again. The loud, steady rhythm of bullets filled the air. Amira fired with all her strength, sweeping across the ridge and forcing the attackers to retreat. Bilal covered her, reloading when she ran out. Together, They created a wall of fire that turned the tide. When the enemy finally started retreating, cheers erupted from the soldiers. They had held the ridge again against all odds. Amira's arms ached, her clothes were torn, and her leg throbbed with pain. But she stayed at the gun until the last shot was fired. Then she collapsed beside it, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down her face. Bilal knelt beside her and laughed weakly. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Amira smiled, too tired to reply. Around them, soldiers hugged, cried, and patted each other on the back. The ridge was safe once more. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the commanding officer approached her. "You turned the tide today," he said. "You saved not just this ridge, but every soldier on it." Amira looked at the smoking valley below. "We all did," she replied. "No one fights alone." That night, the camp was quiet again. The wounded rested, the fires burned low, and the stars shone brighter than they had in days. Amira sat by the edge, watching the horizon. Her hands were still trembling from the battle, but there was peace in her heart. She thought about her father, her village, and the promise she had made years ago, to protect others no matter what. She had kept that promise not once, but again and again. She knew the war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more danger, and more moments when fear would test her courage. But now she understood something deeper. Real strength didn't come from weapons. It came from heart, from standing up when everyone else falls, from choosing bravery over fear, and from fighting not because you have to, but because others need you to. Amira looked at the stars and whispered quietly, "Tomorrow will come, and I'll be ready." The night after the battle was strangely quiet. The wind that blew across the ridge carried the smell of smoke and metal. Amira sat near a campfire, wrapping a bandage tighter around her leg. Every muscle in her body ached, but her mind refused to rest. Around her, the soldiers were trying to sleep, some whispering prayers, others staring silently at the stars. For the first time in days, there were no gunshots, no shouting, no explosions. Only the soft crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. It almost felt peaceful. But deep inside, Amira knew it was only the calm before another storm. She looked at the faces around her. Men who had fought beside her. Men she had treated when they were bleeding and broken. Some were barely older than boys. She felt a wave of pride and sadness at the same time. They had survived together. But for how long? Before dawn, the sound of footsteps woke her. It was Sergeant Bilal. He crouched beside her and whispered, "Amira, command just got word. The enemy's regrouping again. They're planning one final push before sunrise." Her heart sank. The soldiers were exhausted. They had almost no ammunition left, and many were injured. But there was no time to rest. Amira stood up, ignoring the pain in her leg. "Then we fight one more time," she said. Within minutes, the camp was alive again. Soldiers scrambled to their posts, ammunition boxes were passed around, and the officers gave quick orders. The ridge looked fragile in the faint morning light, like a scarred wall barely holding together. Amira checked her medical bag. It was nearly empty. Only a few bandages, some painkillers, and a roll of gauze remained. She took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The horizon was turning red, like fire spreading behind the mountains. Then it began. The enemy's mortars exploded in the distance, shaking the ground. The men shouted and took cover. Bullets rained down from every direction. The ridge became a storm of noise and dust once again. Amira ran toward the front line. She could barely hear her own heartbeat over the gunfire. Soldiers were falling left and right. She pulled one back to safety, then another, wrapping wounds as fast as she could. Her hands moved automatically, press, tie, lift, drag. "Medic! Over here!" someone yelled. She turned and saw Bilal pinned behind a rock, firing at the advancing enemy. "We're losing ground," he shouted. Amira looked toward the south slope. He was right, the defense line was breaking. The enemy had brought heavy weapons this time. The machine gun post that she had repaired the day before was hit again, bursting into flames. The officer shouted into the radio, "We need air support now. We can't hold much longer." But the radio crackled with static. Communication was cut again. Amira's eyes darted toward the destroyed radio tent. She made a split-second decision. She threw her medical bag over her shoulder and ran toward it through the chaos. Bullets hit the ground around her, dirt flying in every direction. Someone shouted her name, but she didn't stop. She slid into the tent, coughing from the smoke. The radio was smashed, but the backup transmitter still had power. She grabbed the microphone, adjusting the broken antenna. "Base, this is Unit Bravo Ridge," she shouted. "We're under heavy fire. Request immediate air support. Coordinates 29.17 north, 72.9 east. Do you copy?" No answer. Just static. She tried again, louder this time, her voice shaking. "Do you copy? We're losing soldiers. Please respond." Finally, a faint voice came through. "Copy that, Bravo Ridge. Air support on the way. Hold your position." Amira exhaled deeply, relief flooding her chest. But she couldn't relax yet. She ran back outside, shouting, "Air support is coming. Hold the line." Her words spread like electricity. The soldiers, tired and wounded, found new strength. They tightened their grip on their weapons and kept fighting. But the enemy kept coming closer and closer. Amira grabbed a fallen soldier's rifle and took cover beside Bilal. She fired at the advancing troops, aiming carefully. Each shot felt heavier than the last. Her shoulder burned from the recoil, but she didn't stop. "Keep your head down," Bilal yelled. "I'm fine," she shouted back. "Just keep shooting." The sky above roared suddenly. Fighter jets were approaching. Within seconds, explosions rocked the enemy lines. The sound was deafening. Flames lit up the mountainside. The air support had arrived, striking precisely where she had given the coordinates. The enemy began to retreat, scrambling for cover as dust and smoke filled the valley. The soldiers on the ridge cheered and fired their last rounds, pushing back the attackers once and for all. Amira dropped her rifle and fell to her knees, trembling. The battle was finally turning in their favor. Bilal ran to her side, laughing breathlessly. "You did it. You saved us again." But Amira wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on something behind him, a wounded soldier lying near the edge of the ridge. Without hesitation, she crawled toward him. "Don't move," she whispered to the man, pressing her hands over his chest wound. Her gloves turned red instantly. "Stay with me, you'll be okay." He looked up weakly. "You're not a medic, you're a guardian," he said faintly. Then his eyes closed. Tears filled Amira's eyes, but she kept working. No, stay with me," she cried. She refused to give up, even when she knew it was too late. Around her, the battlefield was finally quieting down. The remaining soldiers were gathering, calling for stretchers, helping each other stand. The smoke began to clear, revealing the valley below, burning, but victorious. Amira sat there for a long moment, her hands shaking. The man she tried to save was gone, but hundreds of others were alive because of her courage. When the commanding officer finally approached, he looked at her in silence for a few seconds, then said, "You held this ridge with nothing but a broken radio and your heart. The army owes you everything." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't do it alone. None of us did." He nodded. "Maybe, but you reminded them how to fight." That night, as helicopters carried the wounded away, Amira stood near the edge of the ridge. The stars were bright again. The world was quiet, truly quiet this time. She could hear the wind moving gently through the mountains. She looked down at her hands, scarred, bruised, and stained. These hands had saved lives, fired guns, and held the line when no one else could. In that moment, she realized something. The broken rifle she was once given had not been a curse. It was a symbol. It taught her that strength didn't come from perfect weapons or flawless plans. It came from courage, from refusing to give up, and from standing tall even when everything around you was falling apart. Amira smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Maybe bravery is just love in disguise." The next morning, as the helicopters lifted her and her team out of the valley, the soldiers saluted her. Every one of them knew they owed their lives to her willpower. Amira looked back one last time at the ridge, the place where fear became courage, where she learned who she truly was. The helicopter blades cut through the cold morning air, making a loud rhythmic sound that echoed across the valley. Amira sat near the open door, staring down at the land below. The same land that had burned with fire and fear only hours ago. Now it looked calm again, covered in a soft layer of dust and smoke. The battle was over, but its memory was still alive in her mind. Her leg hurt, her arms were scratched, and her uniform was torn in many places. A medic sitting beside her tried to check her wounds, but she gently pushed his hands away. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Take care of the others first." All around her were soldiers, some bandaged, some too weak to talk, but all alive because of what she and her team had done. When the helicopter finally landed at the military base, a crowd of officers and medical staff rushed forward to help. Amira was carried to a small hospital tent, where she was asked to rest. She didn't realize how tired she really was until she lay down on the cot. As soon as she closed her eyes, the memories came back. The sound of gunfire, the shouts, the radio static, the moment when she thought it was all over. Her hands began to tremble slightly. A nurse noticed and whispered, "You're safe now." Amira nodded, but safety felt strange. She wasn't used to it anymore. Her heart still raced as if she were still out there on the ridge. Hours passed. When she woke again, the base was quiet except for the low hum of generators. She slowly got up and walked outside, leaning on a crutch. The evening sun painted everything orange and gold. She could see soldiers cleaning their weapons, others praying, and some simply sitting in silence. Sergeant Bilal spotted her and waved. "Look who's walking again," he said with a grin. Amira smiled. "Can't let you have all the glory," she replied. He laughed, then became serious. "The commander wants to see you." Amira felt a sudden wave of nervousness. She wasn't sure why. She followed Bilal to the main tent, where the commanding officer stood with several high-ranking soldiers. They all turned as she entered. "At ease, Private Amira Khan," the officer said formally. "Please, come in." She saluted, then stood still, her heart pounding. The officer picked up a report from the table. "We've reviewed the operation. Your actions on the ridge directly saved more than 40 lives. You repaired a broken weapon, called in air support under fire, and continued fighting despite your injuries." He looked up from the paper. "That's not just bravery, that's leadership." Amira felt her face flush. "Sir, I was just doing my duty." The officer smiled faintly. "Maybe, but duty alone doesn't inspire others to stand when everything is falling apart." He paused, then said, "Headquarters has decided to recommend you for the Medal of Valor." The tent fell silent. Amira blinked, thinking she had misheard. "Sir, I don't think I deserve that," she said quietly. Bilal stepped forward. "You do. Every one of us who was there knows it." Amira looked around. The faces staring back at her were full of respect, not just for what she had done, but for who she was. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears. The officer nodded once. "You can rest now, soldier. You've done more than enough." Amira saluted again, her hand trembling slightly, and walked out of the tent. The sky above was darkening, stars beginning to appear. She sat on a bench outside, watching the horizon. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not from pain but from relief. Over the next few days, she recovered slowly. The army base became a calmer place. New recruits arrived, supplies were restocked, and the wounded were sent home. But wherever Amira went, people stopped to thank her. Soldiers she barely knew would salute her or offer her food. One young soldier approached her shyly and said, "Ma'am, because of you, I didn't give up that night." Amira smiled kindly. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "Just promise you'll do the same for someone else one day." A few weeks later, a ceremony was held at the central base. The hall was filled with soldiers, officers, and government officials. Banners hung from the walls, and cameras flashed as the names of honored soldiers were read aloud. Amira stood in line with others, her uniform freshly pressed, her medals shining under the lights. When her name was called, the hall grew silent. "Private Amira Khan," the announcer said, "for extraordinary bravery in combat, for saving lives under enemy fire, and for demonstrating courage beyond duty, the Medal of Valor." She stepped forward slowly, her heart heavy with emotion. As the commander placed the medal around her neck, applause erupted across the hall. Some soldiers even stood and clapped with tears in their eyes. Amira bowed her head respectfully, feeling both proud and humbled. She wasn't thinking about medals or honors. She was thinking about the men who didn't make it back, about the ridge where so many had fought and fallen. After the ceremony, a reporter approached her with a microphone. "Miss Amira," he said, "you've become a national hero overnight. How does it feel to be called the Courage of the Ridge?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't feel like a hero," she said simply. "I feel like a soldier who did what anyone else would do. I was scared, but I couldn't walk away when people needed me." The reporter nodded, clearly moved. "What message would you give to others, especially young women who look up to you now?" Amira smiled softly. "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you don't let fear stop you. Whether you're a soldier, a student, or a mother, you can always be brave in your own way." The crowd around them clapped quietly, touched by her words. That night, Amira sat alone outside the barracks, holding the medal in her hand. The moonlight reflected off its surface, making it glow softly. She thought about her father, her village, and the promise she had made long ago, to protect others no matter the cost. She whispered, "I did it, Baba. I kept my promise." In that moment, she realized something deeper than pride. She had changed the way people looked at women in uniform. She had shown that courage had no gender, no rank, and no limits. When she finally went to sleep, she dreamed of the ridge, quiet now, covered in flowers instead of smoke. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her something no one could ever take away, the knowledge that even in the darkest times, one person's courage could light the way for many. Months had passed since the battle at the ridge, but the memory of that day never left Amira's mind. The sounds, the faces, the feeling of dust and smoke. It all came back to her sometimes in quiet moments, like shadows from the past. Yet, life was slowly returning to normal. Amira had been transferred from the front lines to a training center in the capital city. Her leg had healed, though it still ached sometimes when she walked for too long. The doctors told her to rest, but Amira could never sit still for long. She wanted to be useful, to keep helping others. Every morning, she stood before rows of young recruits, men and women both, teaching them about first aid, survival, and courage. They all listened to her with deep respect. Some had seen her photo in newspapers, others had watched her award ceremony on TV. But when they met her in person, they were always surprised by her simplicity. She never bragged about her achievements. She spoke softly, but her words carried strength. One morning, during a training session, a young woman raised her hand. "Ma'am," she asked shyly, "were you afraid that day, when your rifle broke?" Amira smiled gently. "Yes," she said honestly. "I was terrified. My hands were shaking. I thought I might die. But fear is not your enemy. It reminds you that you're still alive, and that life is worth protecting." The room went silent. Every face was focused on her. Courage,